Joseph Cassidy. I was curious about my great-grandfather, so I started looking up and uh, trying to do his family history research, and I learned that apparently he'd been married 3 times. I had always known my grandfather was an only child, but I didn't realize that his father had been married twice previously, and that the first 2 wives and their children died during childbirth. So the family did not preserve their names nor the sexes of either of the children. So starting from knowns to unknowns, I went through the papers that our family had, and this cemetery deed verified that he had purchased a grave on New Year's Day in 1883. And I knew from speaking with the cemetery that he and his third wife were buried in 1928 and 1933. And now with the address of the grave, they were able to verify that there were 6 total burials, and the first 4 took place in 1883, 1883, 1889, and 1889. Now, to get information from the cemetery further, you had to know the name of the burial, the name of the deceased, and the date or the year of burial. So I knew the date of burial would be January 1st, but I didn't know what her first name was. So I said, "How about Mrs. Joseph Cassidy? Is that enough of a name?" And they said, "Actually, that'll work." So they looked it up, and sure enough, Margaret Cassidy, age 35, was buried there on New Year's Day, but they couldn't find an infant being buried at the same time. So that was curious. So when I visited the municipal archives a few months later, I got Margaret's death certificate up. She had died December 29th, 1882, which made sense that there'd be a couple of days for the wake, and then she'd be buried on New Year's Day. And she's living at 416 East 18th Street. She's the daughter of Felix McCune and Margaret McCune, both born in Ireland, as was she. She's keeping house. And it does mention following parturition as one of the contributing factors, which means that she had given birth. But she was under the doctor's care for 7 days, so I thought, well, she wouldn't be in labor for 7 days, so did she have the baby on the 22nd and then die a week later? So if she had the baby on the 22nd, then clearly it didn't, die, but the grave was purchased in 1883, so they wouldn't, keep the deceased baby around for a week waiting for the mother to die too. They also had a register of death, so they took the similar information, was written down in this 2-page ledger style side to side. She's certificate or registration number 5501 on the bottom of the page. And that number is referenced on her death certificate, so there was a way to cross-reference. And it's basically the same information. You don't get her parents' names in this one, so actually the certificate's a little bit more informative. But sometimes one set of records is lost, or one set of records is easier to read or better preserved. So the challenge was trying to find a Cassidy child born in 1882, and sure enough, on December 22nd, the daughter of Joseph Cassidy and Margaret Cassidy, formerly Margaret McCune, both born of Ireland, living at 416 East 18th Street, and the same doctor. So this I knew was them. And he's 31, she's 35. This is their first child. And the return was put in on New Year's Eve, 1882. Then there's written numbers up above. There's a stamped number for the certificate, but then handwritten numbers, which refers you to page 344 of the Register of Births. So similarly with the deaths, they take the information and write it in the 2-page ledger. Again, she's the yellow line highlighted. So definitely there was a live birth. The child was not stillborn as we had previously been led to believe. She was a female and her name was Mary. Her mother was a few years older than her father. As good Catholics, not surprisingly, Mary was baptized, so she apparently lived a few days for sure. So on Christmas Eve, it says Joseph Cassidy and Margaret McKeon. Now, McKeon and McCune can be different variations of the same name I've seen in Irish surname books, so that's not too concerning. The godparents are Michael Cassidy and Anne Reynolds. I have no idea who Anne Reynolds is, but Joseph had a brother named Michael that more than likely is this godfather. And that was the transcription I was able to get just a few weeks after my visit to Municipal Archives. I wrote a letter to Immaculate Conception, and they sent the certificate back. In the meantime, 20 or so years later, the actual copies of the registers have become available through findmypast.com. Their Catholic Heritage Archives is excellent. It includes the Archdiocese of New York. So here is Mary Cassidy's baptismal entry. It doesn't have any information here that isn't on that certificate, but it's always important to check the most original source you can access. So now that I can access this, I did that. And unfortunately, Mary did die in 1883. I looked in the death index looking for Mary Cassidys that would have been born the previous December that died in 1883. And sure enough, in June of 1883, Mary died. And she died at a different address. She died at 506 East 14th Street, which I found curious. But with further research, it made sense. Her parents are listed as Joseph Cassidy and Margaret Cassidy. It doesn't give her mother's maiden name, so you would want to have and or the birth and baptismal information so that you could identify her mother's name correctly. And then the Macy's and Son handled her death arrangements as did they handle her mother's. And the interesting thing is that Macy's is at 506 East 14th Street. Well, also at 506 East 14th Street, where she died, was the apartment of a Patrick Cassidy and his wife, Anne Murphy. And they are the brother and sister-in-law of Mary's father. And they had a little girl named Mary in 1882 in September. So my theory is that Mary and Joseph moved in with his brother and sister-in-law, and Aunt Anne would have nursed both her own daughter and her niece for the 6 months that Mary lived. Sadly, she died, and her her death registration in the Register of Deaths is here. Their key is marking it. It again doesn't give anything new, but it's always important. If there are duplicate records, you never know. There might be an extra piece. So if you had the death registration, you'd want to look at the death certificate, because in 1882 it listed Margaret's parents' names, whereas the register did not. So when did Margaret and Joseph get married? I asked Immaculate Conception to look, and they couldn't find one. When I found Joseph year or so later, in 1880, in the census, he's living in the United States. He's at 416 East 18th Street, so the same address, and he's living with his wife Margaret and his brother Michael. So I thought, well, that's interesting. They were, married, well over 2 years before their daughter was born. Maybe I need to widen the scope. So when I did, sure enough, on the 25th of November in 1878, Joseph Cassidy married Margaret McKeon. And I don't recognize who the witnesses are, John Heffernan or Margaret Walsh. But it took me a couple of years from my initial visit to Municipal Archives. But, ultimately I did succeed in discovering when and where they married. And since then, those records have also become available in digital form. So the key marks their marriage entry up there were joined in holy matrimony. This is the parish register. And it doesn't give anything additional in the entry, but it's always nice for completion. And as I mentioned, Joseph had been married twice. So here's the death certificate for his second wife, and the way I found her is I looked in the death index for 1889 for all of the Cassidy women that would have been old enough to bear a child. And ironically, in 1889, there was only one. Ellen Cassidy was 34. Every other woman there was either a child or too old to bear children. So I looked up her death certificate, and sure enough, it gave Joseph's name was listed on there. It lists her parents as James Hart and Ann Hart, so I knew that her maiden name was Hart. She also died of pulmonary edema. She doesn't mention parturition. She had been under the doctor's care for 9 months, and she died at 338 East 39th Street. That's why I have the key there. And she, sure enough, was buried through the Macy brothers again at 506 East 14th Street. And then I looked in 1889 to see what other children where children died in 1889, hoping to find one that might be their daughter. And I had to look at quite a few, and sure enough, in 1889 in July, so a couple months after Ellen died, her daughter Anne died. And the way that I know that she's their daughter is, even though it doesn't mention Ellen's maiden name, she lived at 338 East 39th Street. She's 11 months old, and her father is Joseph Cassidy, and her mother is Ellen Cassidy. And she, too, was handled by Macy Brothers at 506 East 14th Street, even though they're living up in the East 30s now. She had a birth certificate, and there the key identifies her street address. She was born on August 2nd, 1888. By this time period, they stopped doing the dual registrations. They had just stopped doing that a few weeks or months earlier. She's the third child born to this mother and the only one living. I have been unable to find evidence of previous children born to Ellen, so they were either stillborn or born in another marriage that I'm not aware of, or she had a couple of children before she was married. And apparently lived enough to be baptized. We know from the death certificate she was 11 months old. So here's her baptismal certificate. Mick Murphy and Kate Hart. I presume that Kate Hart is probably her mother's relative, probably her sister, maybe a cousin or a sister-in-law. And then Mick Murphy, we don't know who he is. And of course, this full digital form of the registration there. She's above the key, the red key in the lower right. No extra information, but for completion, always look at the original if you can. And then finding their marriage record was a big challenge. I finally just kept writing to parish after parish, thinking that if he was up in the East 30s, he must have had his own apartment, but he's not in the city directory. So my theory, I finally think, is that as a widower with no children, he lived as either a boarder, or he lived with his brother Michael and his family, or his brother Patrick and their family, and had, he did stops appearing in the city directory. And but sure enough, on the 20th of December in 1885, and it took me 12 years, or 11 and a half years to track this down, he and Ellen married at the Church of St. Francis Xavier, and Terrence McGowan and Kate Hart were the witnesses. And that's a Jesuit parish on West 15th Street. And Xavier High School, I imagine, is near there. And then looking at the original record, the key marks there's 8 marriages on the page. This one has a different format, but I blew up the one for Cassidy and Hart, and it's in Latin, and then they fill in the names. So they're formerly of Ireland. He's the son of Michael Cassidy. She's the daughter of James Hart. I wish they would have put the mother's names, but this was nice that they did at least give the father's names. And then here is a copy of his third marriage certificate, which is in the family papers, that he married Bridget Benson at the Church of St. Gabriel, where his daughter Anne was baptized in 1892. And her sister Mariah Benson was the maid of honor, and Thomas Hughes was the best man. I do not know who Thomas is. The registration in the church register looks like this. It's the third one down on the right, above the key. As you can see, very basic details. You have no idea that Joseph has been married before, or that either of them is born in Ireland, or who any of their parents were or might have been.